My name is Tania, and my family name is Tamari, and I'm married to Tania Nassir, who's from Bir Zayt. Both my parents came from Jaffa, and they had strong connections to Jerusalem, so I always feel that I'm from Jaffa and Jerusalem at the same time, especially that I was born in Jerusalem. I was born in 1941, and at that time also my father used to live in Ramallah. He had some work in Ramallah and Jerusalem, so he opted as a young man to live in Ramallah. I never really knew why, but but he did. And so when my parents got married, they lived in Ramallah. So I think I have a fortunate background without my realizing it, to have the feeling or the combination of residues of experience and memory from Jaffa and Jerusalem and Ramallah and Beirut, because our house was in Beirut. So I feel I'm really part of all Palestine, even geographically. This is, I think, of course, I became aware of all this, when I became an adult, and even more recently as I'm growing older and older and experiencing what Palestine is all about. I really feel it's so natural that I feel I belong here, because when people ask me when I'm abroad, they keep saying, "Oh, you're all heroes living under occupation, and you're wonderful." And I say, please don't give us that extra halo. We're not heroes. We just belong. And I sincerely feel it, because I feel this is home, and this is what it means. I'm the most comfortable while here. I feel I'm happy here. I feel fulfilled while here. And regardless of the problems of occupation, and they're not just problems, they're very intense and very existential problems. Yet, I think the strength that you get from belonging is what defies all of it. So I'm really Palestinian from all over. I didn't have the fortune really to have much connection with Nablus or Jenin or that area. But I have a strong connection with Hebron, for example, because my father, as a young man, worked in Hebron. And he had many memories and many stories to tell us about Hebron, especially about the embroidered pillows. Many young women in Nablus who were teachers or something. He was a very handsome young man. So they would give him collections of embroidered pillows. And what's funny is my mother is a city woman from Jaffa, and it's a more sophisticated, upbringing and so on. And when they first got married, and she saw all this pile of embroidered pillows of the cross-stitch of Hebron, which was supposed to be like not a sophisticated place at all in the minds of the Jaffa people, she'd say, she got rid of all of them. And this was always a point of a lot of laughter in the house, because I grew up to love Palestinian embroidery, and she herself too. So it's strange how things develop, in one's life and the connections. And that's why I feel very much involved in whatever is Palestine. And it comes naturally, as they say. You don't have to work on it or to pretend, or it's a wonderful feeling, and I wish many people have this kind of feeling.
I think one of the things that you just said that is so true, that really resonates so true, is that idea is that you belong here. It's not that the place just belongs to you,
no,
but rather that you come organically from it. You grew up in these mini gardens,
yes.
You have roots in all of these
Yes,
gardens,
yes.
and I think that's one of the sort of really fundamental differences between Palestinians and Israeli Jews who have come here, is that they insist that the land belongs to them, while the Palestinians feel very naturally that they belong to the land. And two very different conceptions
True.
of this idea of not possession but place.
Yeah, and I think what they're reenacting what they say is history, while we're living it day in, day out. We don't have to imagine it or recreate it or create it. So that's why I think I've always felt also, I was never really an activist in any sense of the word. And now, as I am growing old, activist in the Palestine-Israeli issues, I just lived it. I lived what it was all about. And by nature, I'm not an activist, politically activist. But I feel now why I didn't really, because I do have strong feelings and ideas about the whole issue. The reason why I was not really forthcoming or really strong about my views or even going about and talking about them is because I felt this is so clear. The whole issue is so clear. To me, I'm as a one involved in the arts, and I'm very artistic and very appreciate literature and music, and I'm a singer and so on. And so I know that there's nothing in black and white. Nothing. There are always, but somehow, with the Palestine-Israeli issue, it's really a black and white thing. The essence of it is black and white for me, and that's why I never really, I think, went out and became verbose about this.
Those oppositions. What do you mean by black and white? What does that mean?
That there is a very definite truth to the situation, to me, politically and historically, that Palestinians were living in Palestine, and a homeland for the Jews around the world was created in the minds of people who did not even live in the land itself, and created like an avalanche, a havoc in an international situation, that they created a new state that was not there before, and new truths, and truths between quotations, new realities that played havoc in the world. And nothing was, literally, when you say nothing was the same again, for so many people, not just the people in the area, but internationally. Here you have finally, as the dream of the Jewish people, they wanted a state of their own. One understands their suffering, one understands their need to be recognized, to belong somewhere. But also, one does not understand, and I as a Palestinian will never accept the idea that my homeland was taken to make another people comfortable, while making me miserable for the last 60 years of my life as a person, because I was born in 1941, and I grew up with all what took place. And to me, this is black and white. I just cannot accept that this was done when we as Palestinians had nothing to do with the suffering of the Jews in the world. Because as a person who, my father, kept hearing my father talking about his closest friend who was Jewish. He grew up in the same sort of backyard with a Jewish young man in Jerusalem. My grandmother would be knitting things for my father and for his Jewish friend. But at that time, we didn't the way my father used to talk, he didn't think that it was really somebody who's Jew and who's a Christian or who's a Muslim. And I'm just not saying it just to make a story. It was literally there. So when, from the Jewishness of our friends and the people around us, something that disrupted our lives and disheveled our existence came about, I think it is black. Mm-hmm. And that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you down the road about your father's memory with growing up with Palestinian Jews, and then if he spoke about that transition when European Jews began to settle, and that transition and the tension that went from the sense of familiarity of Jews and Muslims and Christians being all Palestinians to all of a sudden having these European Jews that come in and impose kind of this imperialist, colonialist ideology.
Yeah, I remember an uncle of mine from Jaffa. He was my maternal uncle. He was a young man who was very nationalistic, and it came. I hate to call these things that he's nationalistic or whatnot. I feel these are really normal emotions when you belong to a place. So I know for sure, I heard stories from the family members and also from him himself, how when Tel Aviv started becoming really an important, because he was from Jaffa, and he lived in Jaffa, grew up in Jaffa, became a young man in Jaffa. He had a wonderful voice. I think I took some of his genes and my grandfather's genes. They both had very beautiful tenor voices, and he had a collection of opera records that I would hear as a child. Now I remember I used to hear them, but before I was not really conscious. And my grandfather was very much involved with the Byzantine Greek Orthodox Church, also with the White Russian Church. That's why I was called Tania, my brother Vladimir, and my sister Vera, although we have nothing Russian in us, except that kind of a tradition my grandfather was the dragoman, I think, in the White Russian consulate in Jaffa. So anyway, to go back to the Tel Aviv and my uncle, I know that it was some kind of a European outlet for Jaffa, and it was negatively and positively so, because there would be the presence of a new kind of a threat to the society of Jaffa, and then the what do you call it, the natural kind of culture. Yet at the same time, Jaffa being a cosmopolitan place, being a harbor, there was a lot of contact also with the Western kind of a culture. So it was more or less a natural thing. Yet there was, I remember from hearing later on discussions what a threat it was. And then in 1936, when there was the big movement of the boycott of Israeli goods, of Jewish goods, and the settlement goods, the kibbutz at that time, and it was a big, just something that was there, and they had to deal with it. But one thing that was interesting about my uncle, that I remember very touchingly about, with a lot of feeling, is that as he was the honorary consul for Czechoslovakia at that time as a merchant. My grandparents had orange groves, and they had the soap factory and so on. So they were in the business, and he was involved in this kind of work. He was the honorary consul for Czechoslovakia to deal with trade and I don't know what. And every morning when we used to live in Ramallah, then I'd go and visit my grandparents' house in the winter. We'd spend the winter there because Ramallah is very cold. It's a summer resort. So we'd go, my mother and I, my father sometimes would work in Jerusalem and then go and see us in Jaffa. In the winters would spend in Jaffa. So every morning I remember my uncle would go out to the gate of the house, and he would raise the Czechoslovakian flag, and at night, they would lower it down. And there was some kind of a ritual. I remember it because he would let me, do the whole thing. But later on, I learned is that when the UN resolution to divide Palestine, the
resolution, the partition plan.
The partition plan. Of the creation of Israel and so on and so forth, Czechoslovakia, of course, voted for the creation of Israel. The next day, he wrote his resignation, and that flag never grew up again. Yeah. So it was this kind of a memory that I have of these things.
When you write, as I mentioned earlier, you write as if like you're painting a still life, and I'm wondering if maybe you can kind of give us a bit of a description of what that everyday life in your house was like, from a child's point of view, the settings, the pictures, the tables, the furniture, that kind of everyday life in a Palestinian home.
In Jaffa, that was my childhood. I remember very vividly a ritual that is no more done around here, because Birzeit and Ramallah, and this is a mountain area. It was the making of the rose water and orange water, and my grandmother was very good at this. The house was a lovely old house. I have photographs of it in my childhood album. Would you like to see those? But later on we can, later on you can photograph those. My grandfather had a very good library. I remember vaguely, but I would remember, records of classical music. Usually, that's the household I grew up in. It's and I remember when the aroma of the rose flowers, when the rose petals, they would come in. If they had large orange groves, and in the orange groves they also had rose bushes planted to make the rose water. The rose, there was a concoction or some kind of a contraptions of how to, for these things to evaporate the water, to the petals. Anyway, they would collect the petals in big sacks of burlap, and I remember the aroma of the rose petals and the orange petals, orange blossom, and they would make them into what do you call it, brass, copper containers, and they would boil water underneath. It's like distillation.
Yeah, it's a still.
And yes, and they would drop. I remember watching the drops coming down, to collect just a little bit of things like this. And this to me was a big ritual to watch. Another ritual was going in a carriage to the orange groves. Another thing that I remember was now I know that it was my first experience with a big festival called Rubin, where all the people from Jaffa would go for a big picnic to a river, like a river. I think they had springs there, and it was to celebrate Rubin's day. I think he was some kind of a prophet or not what you call it.
A holy person.
A holy person, something like this, and the river was named after him. I'm not really good at remembering the details, but I remember that was the first time I saw people taking big tanjara, what you call it, pots of food that we usually eat at home, but they would eat it out in the open as a picnic, and eating the first popsicle. I remember, sucking on ice, and I remember something red, so it must have been maybe strawberry or cherry or something like this. So I remember also how they had a piano. My grandparents had lots of icons because of their Russian Orthodox Church, yeah. And one of my uncles, who later immigrated to Australia and wanted to be an actor, would take us on sit down and tell us stories and imaginary things about his travels and where how he was very imaginative. So I had a wonderful my grandparents' house. In my parents' house, in Ramallah, I remember very vividly a very, very quiet childhood now that I've grown up. My mother would say it's the best place to raise children because Ramallah was a summer resort. In the summer, people from Jaffa and Haifa and so on would come. They bring even their furniture and rent empty apartments or homes and live in Ramallah for all the summer months. Because they would run away from Jaffa and the humidity of the sea and so on. This was a tradition for the residents of Jaffa and Haifa and Akka to come to Palestine, to Ramallah area. And I remember my mother would say how everybody would make lots of get-togethers, family, and they would meet at Grand Hotel, which was called Hotel Ode, and it was owned by Ramallah family, and a big pine garden that later on became a tradition for us also to go to and enjoy the summers. And they would, the owners would bring musicians from Napoli in the summers that was in the 50s. I remember very much living this kind of a life of going in the evenings, enjoying dancing, and I even participated in amateur contests for singing, got a prize here or there, and this was the life in Ramallah.
So even after Israel became a state in Ramallah, there was life almost had this normal rhythm about
Oh
it.
yes, yes, very much so. The first few years, I think, the only abnormal rhythm too was the I think where we were very conscious of the refugee presence, and I remember it physically very well because I remember the people living under trees, and we had a courtyard, a fruit orchard near our house, and people would uh, they came and settled under the trees, and they would put partitions of newspapers between them, so that they would, before they finally found a room here or a room there. Probably this took a few weeks or a month or two, but to me it was like something of a tremendous impact.
And you remember that visually?
I
just
remember
families-
visually. I remember visually people sitting under trees and having newspapers like this. I don't know if I asked questions about it, if people explained things to me, because I was 7 or at that time, but I really don't know. But what I also remember very painfully is that my aunt talking about their leaving Jerusalem on the 14th of May. They were living in Mascobia, in the Mascobia compound, and I remember how they said a relative or something came and told them the British have finally left, and the shooting and the battles in Jerusalem have really intensified, and you cannot stay here any longer. You have to flee. So literally they fled, and my aunt kept remembering. Because I was so young, it didn't dawn on me how dramatic that was. But now I would imagine, because she said, I left the pot of mjaddara on the burner while cooking, and with one foot I put a shoe, and I couldn't find the other one, so I left with one shoe and one slipper on. So now I can imagine, with nothing. They had a beautiful house full of lovely antiques and things like this, and
Just left.
they just left because they just had to live. It's for life. When you say you fly, you really fly for your life. Or you.
So this idea, this experience when you were 7, and I'm going to just maybe push you a little bit more
Yes.
to remember some of those images, like the stories of your aunt that leaving with one shoe and the mujaddara on the stove and the families under the trees. And at what point for you as a child did you begin to understand this idea of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, that all of these Palestinians had been kicked out? And when do you remember that?
I think much later in my teens probably, because I also had an experience, a physical experience myself, that I put together much later on, is that in 1948, and in May, my uncle who lived in Jerusalem came, and I remember this word convoy very much, because later on I remember how my father would tell us the story, how my uncle came from Jaffa, 2 uncles. The eldest uncle, who was quite old, with 2 young men as children, his boys, and my other uncle, who had a car, and he put my older uncle with his wife and family, and his wife, all the members of the family came in one car, ran away from Jaffa, running away. But they kept saying convoy, and what I later discovered is they came with a few friends who owned cars. They drove to Ramallah, stopped in Ramallah overnight, stayed at our house, and convinced my father that we should flee also, because we are very young. I'm the eldest in my family. I had a younger brother and a younger sister. And he told my father, what are you waiting for? Didn't you hear of Deir Yassin, what's happening to women and children? I have my car, and we can find another car, and we should all go to Lebanon, because usually this is what they did to spend the summers in Lebanon. They'd say, we'd go, I'm sure you've heard the story before, we'd go for the summer months, and things would settle down by then, we'll know what's happening, and we can return. Why should you expose your mother, your wife, and children for this? So my father finally agreed, and we did go to Lebanon. But what I vividly remember of that, because I call it when we fled, because literally it became like fleeing. Near Kalandia there was a battle raging on, and between the Mujahideen, between probably the Thawar, the revolutionaries, and Israel and the Jews. And I remember vividly being pushed down at the bottom of the car. I don't know how, we were so many, and blankets pushed on top of us. Almost we were suffocating. And I later remember, because I was retold that there was this battle, because I remember hearing. I remember hearing it, but the fear, what was happening, I was 6 at that time, so I was really, didn't know what was going on. Then stopping in Jericho and having a picnic almost, because it was Easter, and my mother had done the cakes for Easter and dyed the special eggs for Easter eggs, to celebrate Easter. So they took it along because it was ready. They took it with them on this trip. And I remember stopping in Jericho at one of the monasteries or a church. I remember a courtyard of a church or something like this, and eating ka'ku ma'mul and eating eggs. So, and we went then to Lebanon and stayed in hotels for the months of the summer. Then we couldn't return easily because there was the creation of Israel and all the political issues and the borders and so on. And then staying at my father's, almost, all his savings, everybody's savings were almost gone in just paying for hotels. And I remember later on how my parents said, we were having a wonderful menu, of 5-star menu and so on, and we started dwindling to just one meal a day with little bits for breakfast and dinner at the hotels, because we just had to make ends meet. And then we returned to Ramallah in the 1949-50, at the end of
So
49.
you
Stayed the whole year in Lebanon, and that's why I went for my first year at the Friends School for my nursery, first grade nursery school. And Bromana High School. It was a Quaker school.
Did your friends that had come and convinced your dad to go, they were from Haifa or from Jaffa?
From Jaffa.
Did they ever go back to their homes?
No.
They were gone.
No. They were gone, and they settled in Lebanon.
They did.
Yeah. But we were the only ones because we lived in Ramallah. Ramallah was safe.
It was still part of Jordan. Jordan took it over.
Yes, took it over.
Yeah. And when you said when you were a teenager, you began to understand what happened, which is very natural, because when you're a child, you just experience. You don't necessarily always process that experiences. Can you remember sort of what you felt and how these realizations came about? What informed you about him?
My parents. My father was a real nationalist, I would call. He didn't belong to any organization or any group or anything like this, but he was just a Palestinian and very, very conscious of the injustice and very supportive of finding a solution, and always read books, whatever. I remember journalists would come to our house and so on as a young woman, and he was very intense about it. And intense of really telling the truth, of showing the truth and talking to people and supporting. And he was very, very supportive of young people who were refugees in trying to help them find work, trying to find education. He really believed in education. In retrospect now, I remember how many people would come to his office. He was a businessman. And just consult with him and talk to him, and if you can help us do this. And he would connect with a consulate here to find them scholarships to go and study and come back and work with their parents, or this kind of thing. And I remember him that he was also very much of a supporter of the Thawar at one stage. And we have photographs of that I have also memories of one of them who who was wounded. And my father invited him to stay in our house to recuperate. And my mother told us later on how she would take his grenades, and put them on top of the cupboard, so we will not play around with them, and that he would go after he became well, But he didn't stay, of course, with us. But I remember a family story that goes on. He once put on his thuwar, the
Yeah,
garb
yeah.
of a revolutionary, the bullet, what do you call it?
Ammunition.
Ammunition and his gun, and my brother wore it, and my father wanted to take a photograph or something of that, and I thought that Vladimir, my brother, was going to go to war.
Mm.
And I remember I went into the bathroom and locked myself and started crying because I didn't want to take him to battle. So I must have been conscious of the time, of the fear of a battle or what it meant, death and this kind of thing. So this is a story my parents used to tell. And I remember just locking myself up and being scared that he would be taken to war.
Absolutely.
So,
If you could talk a little bit about your life as you began to grow up, where you went to school, the university, and how life evolved.
yeah.
Just from your personal experiences, but if also maybe you could also link it to your, as you became more and more conscious of this culture of refugees that had. Now I don't know if a lot of people stayed in Ramallah, or they went into a lot of villages nearby.
Yes. Yeah.
But just your personal life, and then maybe some interactions with people that were at this place.
Sure. I went to after our return from Lebanon, the school that was, quite well known all over Palestine. We were lucky to have a friend's schools in Ramallah. It's a Quaker school. There was a boys' school and a girls' school, and I went to the girls' school with my brother and sister. And later on, my brother went to the boys' school. After elementary school, they divided the whole thing. So I was very fortunate, and now I realize it more than ever, to be exposed to. It was not a Quaker culture by any means as a declared culture, but the way the school was run, the way I received my education from the teachers. There was so much dedication and so much liberal thinking, now that I think about it. No kind of even discussion, although religion was taught in one way or the other, but it was in a spiritual sense and the ethics. We had everyday meetings, assembly, and people would say a few things. As we grew up, the students, we were allowed to talk once in a while at the assembly. Excuse me. Usually there was always a proverb at the end. And that's why, what does this teach you, children? But it was never didactic. It was never something imposed. I always remember very comfortably the way I was taught. I was lucky. I had good teachers. And I was terrible in math and science. It was not my cup of tea. But I always enjoyed literature and the languages. And I remember, now that we're talking about how my consciousness of the politics and what was happening came through one teacher who was from Jerusalem. Her name was Asma Faris, who was a real nationalist, in the sense that she was almost an activist in nationalism, but nothing disturbing about, you should do this and you should do that. No. But she would tell us, she opened our eyes to the politics, to what was Zionism, to what was Palestinian Arab nationalism. Also, Arab nationalism was the big thing at that time. It was not Palestine, really. It was the whole grand Syria of Lebanon and Syria and of Jordan was part of it, of course. And about Egypt being the really, Abdel Nasser came about in the 50s. And that's how I became very, very conscious of my, I always hate to call it a political commitment. It's a nationalist thing. And patriotism, I don't know, I'm always confused between what is the closest to what I feel. Is it nationalism, patriotism, or a combination of so many things? Of both of these things, but definitely I'm not fanatic about belonging to a party. On the contrary, I think I have negative feelings about political parties. I'm not the type who really I respect people who are dedicated, but I feel it makes you lose a lot of your humanity and liberal thinking if you belong to a political party. And I feel people, in our part of the world, so many people are committed to parties and ideologies that somehow they lose something in the process. So that's what the time when I really became conscious. And then when I graduated from the French Girls' School, I went to Lebanon, to the Beirut College for Women at the time. It had several hundred, I think 500 or 700 women students, but closely connected with AUB in the sense that we were their sister institution, the American University in Beirut. And so I feel I've always gotten the best of both worlds. I was in a women's community and I enjoyed it. And also I had all the benefits of being in next to a big, large university and all the young men who would seek the women in the women's college. So it was, and there too, I became also aware, much more than anywhere else, of the political issues, the nationalism. And Beirut at the time was in 50. I graduated in 58. That's when I went to Beirut, and stayed there till 62. So it was really at the time when a lot was happening in Lebanon, intellectually, in literature, in the arts, a lot of experimental work in theater. And I studied literature and theater at the college, but I did a lot of other things. Music, and I was very active on campus, and it was an enriching experience being in Beirut at the time, because Ramallah was literally a small town, really far away from the middle of things. On the contrary, Beirut was in the center of all what was going on in the Arab world.
And it was probably the single most sophisticated city.
It was, and now I realize what a gift it was for me to grow up in Lebanon. And when our children grew up under occupation and going back, when my husband was deported, and children going back and forth, feeling unsettled, all this, I felt this is why I also have this feeling all the time that our children were robbed of a normal life, and what could have been an enriching life. I mean, any experience could be enriching, but it need not be a negative experience to strengthen you. And we've really been robbed.
Yeah, I think there are several generations in here that have been robbed of their life, of their ability to just.
And that's why I always say it's black and white. We need not have paid the price for what happened to the Jews in the world to create this, or I don't know how else it could have been worked out, but for me it is really this is the tragedy of, and this is it's the crime, really. It's a crime that you impose this on another people that had nothing to do with it. Usually you pay a punishment, you are punished for something bad you've done. We've not done it.
No,
and it's unfair. The unfairness is phenomenal, and I think this is what kills me up till now. There is an injustice and an unfairness that is not resolved, and until this is resolved, I think nothing would work out. Nothing. It's not just the land. There's the morality of it, and it's a horrible feeling to grow up with this and to feel it. Grow up with your children and not knowing what's going to happen to your children. And now I have my granddaughters here visiting in Palestine. They're sensitive. They say they have cousins who live in Jerusalem. They come from Jerusalem to visit them because they can, while we in the West Bank cannot go to Jerusalem to visit them. And they ask, why can't we go to play with so-and-so or so-and-so? And, I feel sometimes, is it fair to, and they wouldn't be able to absorb the whole, you have blocks and you have checkpoints and there are soldiers and this. What do you tell your grandchildren? So I become really angry and emotional about this. It's gone on too long, really, and it's not fair. It's not fair, really.
No, it's one of the biggest tragedies in modern history.
It is.
If not the
It
biggest.
is. And you can't. You're not making it up. This is what. When people tell us, you Palestinians were not good at PR. You were not good at. It's crazy. It's an insult. It's really insulting when you think, is it a matter of PR? It is, of course. I'm not a child to know but this is we've been violated, and I think it's really horrible. And unless the world, and I think the world needs to know this, and now more and more probably people are aware, because when they come and they see, and this is the only way, by the way, I think that people will realize what's going on in Palestine under occupation, is when they come. No amount of documents, no amount of books or readings or interviews or this and that. I'm not belittling your interviews, but unless they come, because this is, I think, again, a black and white thing for me. They would know, they would feel what we're living, what occupation is all about, and the injustice.
It's very visible all around.
It is very, very physical and visible and existential to.
Absolutely.
When you put your foot in the place, you know.
Yeah.
You don't have to be told.
Do you think, actually, I mean, this is something that I'm interested in exploring, but as a writer and a musician, do you think art has a role in actually kind of shaping public opinion?
Yes, it does. But it should be done also in a very, very sophisticated and very honest and not in fanfare or in being used. I hate to be manipulated and used in explaining my because it's an honest, down-to-earth, clear-cut issue or situation. And if you manipulate it, it's like you're sacrificing a lot of truth and beauty and honesty about the issue. And that's why I used to not feel comfortable with nationalist paintings and nationalist slogans and symbolic use of the map of Palestine and so on. But I think I understand that it has a role. In certain situations, it has a role. I'm not the person to do it, nor to be, not to be, really part of it. But I appreciate that it has a role. These straightforward, what do you call them? Straightforward nationalist symbolism in painting, in music, in writing, and so on. What I've discovered. Again, I think when things come really innately, or something from your soul, it carries this kind of another kind of a level of a message. I'm a classical singer, and I've always sung Western kind classical singing arias and lieder and in different languages, in English, German, Italian, things like this. But slowly, as I grew, especially in college, I became very much aware of the beauty of Arabic literature, modern Arabic literature. And I discovered a lot of poetry, modern poetry, and I'm inclined towards modern poetry and novel writing, more poetry really. And I discovered how these poems are really expressive of what I feel. It's me. When I sing something in German or Italian or English, I enjoy them. It's beautiful music, fantastic compositions, but it's not really me. That I'd like to sing in a language, because words were very important to me, you see. And I wanted the words and the music to be really me. And so I became conscious that I started looking for compositions done in Arabic, but in Western classical compositions. And I was very lucky that when I married Hanna from the Nassir family, his sister, Rima Nassir Tarazi, was a composer who composed in classical composition. She studied in Paris, but she used Arabic lyrics for her music, and some of them were for solo compositions. So I started learning those and enjoying them very, very much. And my husband had a cousin called Amin Nasser, who was also a composer, studied in Vienna and Germany, and he also used Arabic lyrics for local Palestinian poets. One of them was Kamal Nasser, who was also my husband's first cousin, who was a great poet and became a very close friend, and he was later murdered by the Israelis in Lebanon in 1974, as he became the PLO spokesman at the time. So my introduction to friends and close family members who composed in this style gave me the opportunity to really put these two things together. And later on, I started also looking for people. I would find my own poetry, the things that I would love to sing, and also give it with Amin Nasser, for example. I had this kind of a relationship, and he would compose things to the poetry that we would both share and discuss, and he would have to, of course, agree to. One of them was a very beautiful poem for Fadwa Tuqan, who was a well-known Palestinian poet who lived in Nablus. Her brother was called Brahim Tuqan. He was also a very well-known poet in the 30s and 40s. So all this combination made me express my identity. I now call it, although it's not so really serious feeling. It's more of a wonderful, expression of oneself. About how I feel about things. Many of those later on, the songs were nationalist in essence, and the most fulfilling of my singing Arabic music about my identity, my feeling as a Palestinian, were the songs that Rima composed and put the lyrics for, and she's a woman activist in women affairs, political activist, and as well as a composer. She's a fantastic woman, and she wrote about her experience under occupation, her experience of what was happening under occupation, the suffering of the people, the demolishing of homes, the martyrdom of young people, and so on. She would put it in song. And it was always a personal, like a tribute or eyewitness almost experience. And then she would tell me, Tania, how about listening to this? And it started with a song for the International Year of the Child in 1979. And she wrote a song for the children of Palestine. And in it were experiences of deportation, of how homes were destroyed, of how people were put in prison, how people resisted, how children were fighting and for their for people against the soldiers who would come and take their parents from the house or their father, or seeing their neighbor being killed. And when I heard it, I told Rima, this is not a song for children. You can do it for it's a song I would love to sing. And so I started a whole series with Rima. We both did about 13, 14, 15, maybe 16 songs along those lines. And they're finally out in a CD called Ila Mata, Until When. And most of these songs were a wonderful, wonderful, source of support and strength for me when I was living in Jordan, when my husband was deported in exile. He was in exile for 19 years. I would sing them at fundraising lunches or dinners or breakfast for help for prisoners in Palestine, for victims of the occupation, for women whose husbands were in prison. And so they were a means for me to express my own feelings, and at the same time being practical in helping raise funds to help back in Palestine when I was not able to be part of Palestine. Probably city people feel the same about their city, but I think there's something missing. I think this is more wholesome somehow. I pat myself on the back and say
it's a remarkable place. It's a very rich and complex culture. I mean, it's very rough and rugged,
yes,
but at the same time has a lot of tenderness in it.
Yes, and especially with the connection, I think, of the people coming back and forth from Jaffa and Haifa and so on. There were two almost intercultures, and the schools that were in Ramallah, the French schools, with people coming from abroad. There were also the local schools that were also well attended from people from the villages. So it was Ramallah like my mother always being the Jaffa person who felt the sophistication of it, she'd say, this Ramallah, it's a big village. What are they talking about? And then when they declared it the capital of Palestine, she just had the tongue in cheek, saying, my goodness, look what happened to us. This is another thing. This is part of that Ramallah that was supposed to be a simple resort, no matter what it is, now becomes the capital of Palestine. I mean, there's an irony in there with the loss of some place like Jerusalem and Jaffa and all these places. So I always remember, although my mother, during the first Intifada, I've never seen her more conscious of her identity, of her being, as an active person in the society. She would really support people in the neighborhood, and the way they tried to grow things and support, all sorts of issues that were very and she was an older woman now, in her 70s at the time. But she found herself, I think. And it was a wonderful, like a metamorphosis, and that she grew up to this level of maturity. I mean, she was in the 70s, you'd call this maturity, but there was an inner maturity, like a whole thing came into place. And I think this is what the first Intifada was all about. For a few months, people took things in their own hands, in the purity of the cause, in an intelligent, well-planned, intellectually sophisticated too. There was a combination of so many issues in the first Intifada. And I think even though it fizzled, I hate to use the word, but it did, even though in some sense there was a sense of it didn't continue, because it could never have continued in this pure form. And that's why I say we should not look at the idea that it didn't continue as negative. No. The idea that it took place was really good. Absolutely. And that's why we should get inspiration from an experience like this to build on, and maybe we can't run away from it. We have to go on. And so maybe one should start thinking of another kind of resistance, of another mode of life with the changes around you. You have to keep changing Absolutely. Your own, like, maneuvers, as they say. Although, John, really, to be honest, I was talking to friends the other night who were visiting from the States. I think because we're growing older, and because we're finding the whole world system becoming so complex and so connected to so many issues, that we can't find, I think, it will never be an ideal situation, but the situation where we as Palestinians can deal with our own issues. Mm-hmm. We are meddled in. This has been, of course, our problem for years, from the creation of Israel. This was meddling in our affairs. Mm-hmm. But more and more, we are never left alone to really figure out what we should do with ourselves. And that's how we messed up in so many situations. We've had so many negative experiences. And I hate to keep blaming it on others, but it's the situation. Yeah. And that's why, again, I feel the injustice of it. That people who sometimes have problems, you tell your children, deal with it. It's your problem, deal with it. It will make you stronger. You will finally reach a solution that will make you a healthy person in most cases. So deal with it yourself. But we cannot. Yeah. We're never left alone to deal with it.
No, there's always somebody trying to deal with it for you in their own favor, not in the favor of the Palestinians.
Indeed.
It's the Americans, it's the Europeans, it's the Arab countries, and of course Israel's trying to deal with it.
Yeah, it's there now, so you can't run around the bush and say.
That's that sort of organic resistance that happened in the first Intifada. That was very unique.
Yes.
I mean, there were, I think, historically before establishment of Israel, there was a lot of these sort of organic resistance movements against the British, and they were crushed very severely.
Yes.
But I don't think there was another one until the 1987-88 Intifada.
And I think it will go down in our history as something really very positive and very sophisticated, and again carrying a lot of what we are. I think that's what's lovely about it.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, it didn't go on, but we know why. I think it's not that simple.
No, it's not. Nothing is simple. But I think it could be, it's a lesson, I think, that hopefully Palestinian youth can learn a great deal from.
This room actually reminds me of the whole incident of my husband's deportation. We were living in Birzeit at the time. My husband got his degree, PhD degree from Purdue University. I had got married in '64 and left to live in the States until he finished his degree. And another phenomenal experience was that I was here for the June War. Hannah was supposed to finish his work on his doctorate in July, and I said it's too hot in Indiana to wait for another summer, so I decided that I'll return finally with our son Musa, our first son, and who was born there, and wait for Hannah to come back and then just live here, because this was our aim all along. His involvement with Birzeit College and his family's involvement with it, so that was it. And I was very happy to be here, to return and live here. No other choice or even thought. So I was here in June, in May, and returned mid-May and June, and the war took place. And Hannah was away. So from the many, many experiences of that time, to have Hannah return, I had to apply for a reunification plan for him, because I was living here during the war, the '67 war. And so he came sometime in September, I think, August. He got a visa on his Jordanian passport to come through Tel Aviv. And that's how he returned here. Ever since his return, he became very actively involved in Birzeit College. That was a family project at that time, and he took the leadership of the college from his father, Tania Nassir, who had helped his sister, who originally started this small elementary school in her father's house, in this house where we are here. And her brother Musa helped her, my father-in-law. And later on, when she passed away, it became his project too, apart from many things that he'd done in his life. And his 8 sisters, he had 8 sisters, it was also they supported it too and ran it. And when my husband came back, and in July, in '72 or something like this, there became a realization in Palestine, in the West Bank, that there needs to be a university here, because the Israelis had a law at that time to prohibit young people, young men especially, who leave the country for study, to return. They had to stay abroad for 9 months and then return, and then not allowed to return, to leave again, or something complicated like this. Now, you have to research this. I can't remember the details. But because of that, it meant that many young people, especially men, would leave the country to study, because there was no university in Palestine, and would not return, or be harassed on the bridge, on the crossings, and imprisoned and so on. So Hannah, with his colleagues at the college, decided that Birzeit College should really attempt at becoming a university. And they declared this, and despite the occupation, it did take place. And the year in '74, the Abu Ammar, so this was my husband's background at that time. In '74, Abu Ammar spoke at the United Nations in November. And the whole West Bank went in uproar and turmoil, and in support of Abu Ammar and against occupation. It was a real strong upheaval. And during those days, a young woman in Nablus was killed by the Israelis. So the university students made a silent march around the university campus in protest of what happened. On that day, the Israeli army, of course, would not allow something like this. They came with lots, just really jeeps and armored cars and themselves armored, and they were about to start shooting on the students, not allowing them to express themselves. My husband, being the president of the university, said, "You can't do this. You will have a bloodbath on your hands. These people are my responsibility. Allow me to take them back into campus, and I promise you there will not be anything." So this happened. He walked with the students. He was not demonstrating with them, but he finally did, because he took them back into campus. The university was closed. The administration closed it, sent the students back home. There were some boarding students who returned, and the army remained encircling the whole campus. We lived on campus at that time. So, we all felt that there was something amiss. This was something major, and it will not pass, like this. So that night, in the evening, around 8 or so at night, we were at home, and we get a call. I answered it from the military governor's office, saying, "We would like want to talk to your husband." And finally, what happened? They asked him to go to meet the military governor at 11 o'clock at night. And at that time, it was sort of common for leaders of the community and so on to meet with the military governor for all sorts of issues to run the place, or protests, or there are things against occupation. It was more or less a practical thing that they would meet with the military governor. So, but this time it was not a normal time. What happened was not a normal time. So we were very apprehensive. Well, to make the story short, he never returned home. In the morning, I alerted my family and the people from the university. And I remember I came here, because this was the old campus. And this was a sitting room for the family and the teachers. It was still, the family was still involved at that time. And journalists would come, and I sat with the children here, not knowing what was happening to me. And we didn't know where he was. While sitting here, I received a call from a friend. She said, "Tania, I just heard something on the Hebrew radio, and they mentioned Hannah's name and my husband's name, who was at that time at the municipality, and few people, but I don't understand Hebrew. I don't know what was happening." So we waited until the Arabic newscast, and they said that this morning, 5 Palestinian leaders or community people were deported to the borders of Lebanon, because they were a threat to the security of Israel. So that's how we realized that he was deported. We didn't know. We kept asking the military governor's office, and they would say, "Well, he's at a meeting. We're discussing the issues. Too complex. What's happening in the West Bank, and too much of a dangerous situation. And they are leaders, and they have to calm things down, and so on." I kept thinking he was imprisoned. Really, I didn't think of deportation at the time at all. So that was really like a bombshell. And I was terribly lost. The children were around me, journalists were calling me, and I was trying to handle it as a big nationalist issue of occupation and so on, while it was very private affair too. What's going to happen to us? It was quite an experience at the time. Anyway, so that's how Hannah got exiled. And we stayed for a whole year out of principle. I went to see him after several months, because my papers as an ID were not. He and I were on the same ID, so I had to make a special document so that I'll be able to go out. But his sister, who had a Jerusalem ID, was able to go and come back and returned and told us he was well and good health and so on. So that was the first feedback we got. At that time, of course, no phone calls, nothing. I went to see him with our eldest son for the first 6 months or so. I kept going every few months with one of the children to see him. We met in Jordan. Once we met in Lebanon, then in Jordan, because it was closest. And we had family. And then at the end of a year where he couldn't come back, he said, "You can't it's illegal to deport me. raise a case against me. If I'd done something wrong, I'll be in prison. But you cannot. But this never worked. So I finally had to decide to leave with the children. We had 4 children, and the youngest, Randa, was a baby, which was 9 months. And we lived in Jordan because it was closest to here, and we could see family and friends, and we had lots of friends and family in Amman.
But Hannah couldn't come back.
For 19 years, he never returned. His mother passed away during that time. Everybody who wanted to see him would cross the bridge, and that's another story. I think this needs another lifetime of documentation. This should be your next project. Really.
People going to visit him.
Not just my husband, but just the idea of the bridge. I want to write about the changes that took place. And I feel I never could do this because it needs a lot of research. I'd like, in our lifetime, an experience of the bridge. I think you can write a whole new chapter of what took place in Palestinians' lives, who kept going back and forth just to keep the relationship going. And if you call it, and it's literally a bridge, you know, it's not really a border. And so many, and the incidents that happened, hundreds and thousands can recount on the harassment, and also on the support, on the bonds of being there because you wanted to cross and go back home, you know. It's, to me, every time I think of it, I feel it's like my duty, it's like something I need to write about. But I need help with this in the sense it needs a lot of research, like what you're doing. Yeah. So that's what we lived in Jordan for 19 years.
During that time, he was still running the university?
He was still running the university, fundraising the university. This was the challenge, you see, and that was what was wonderful about the university people too. They said, you remain the president. He had an office in Amman for the liaison office for the university, and that's another story of how he would meet with deans and teachers and professors, would go to all sorts of lengths to meet either in Cyprus or in Europe, or some would come to Amman to decide on issues and the program of the university, educational issues, not political.
Right.
So that's how it went on until in 1993, after Oslo. And for people who, you know, say Oslo is horrible, bad, I say, well, privately and personally, selfishly, I see the loopholes, but to us, we returned home. And so many others did.
A lot of Palestinians.
Yes. And I think we can never belittle this, apart from all the negativism of Oslo.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it has its perpetual problems.
Yes.
It also
so that was a big celebration, and we were home. We were really home. Yeah.
During that time, you came back.
I would cross, and I made it a point, consciously or unconsciously. I don't know how I've done it really now. When I remember the bridge and the hell of the bridge, the experiences of not being able to feed the children for 8 hours, no food, no water, the strip search of us and the children, and that's the details I want to write about. It's amazing what one goes through without thinking. It's like, I think it's a survival thing. Like you're now when I'm talking about it, it's like when you're in a jungle or you have in an air crash or something. Somehow you don't know how you survive, but you push the limits, and that's what we did. It was a blessing that we could do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that survival instinct has enabled the Palestinians to survive for 61 years of misery so far.
Yes.
And you just go on and do it.
Yes, you don't think about it. You just don't.
Now, a couple of quick questions about the university and how it operated. During that time, were there a lot of closures of the university?
Yes,
as well?
for 5 continuous years, the university was closed at one time in the 80s. And
what happened to the students during those years?
Oh, that was
chaos in thousands of lives.
I can relate some things because I was not here to experience them, but I would know about them from people who would come and go, or when I would come and listen about and hear about the experiences. Is these students really with their professors did a heroic job in the administration of the university of continuing the education in homes. Yes, they would meet in homes, they would meet in halls, church halls, whatever they would find a meeting place. They would have private lessons on personal levels with their professors, write papers here and there. And I think it was really heroic and miraculous that
So
they were
during
able
those
to
5
come.
years, were the university still giving degrees?
They were giving
They were
degrees,
giving degrees.
undeclared degrees, but they were graduating people.
Mm.
And what was the most moving thing is that some students who finally collected, their what you call them, their hours, their credits, during the year we returned in 1993, it was a graduation year, and they were able to graduate after maybe 7 or some of them 8 years, 7 years, 5 years in a formal graduation ceremony. This was really a fantastic experience.
Absolutely.
But again, to go back to a personal thing that I always moves me, and when I remember, when I become conscious of it, is how I changed in relationship to Palestine when I lived abroad, and I would consider it some kind of an exile, although it was a choice exile. Is that when I would listen, especially to go back to the first Intifada, listen to my mother and my aunt and the neighbors and the older people, not just the young, relate their experiences and how I would feel like an outsider. This pained me more than anything else, is that I was not really part of this. I became like somebody who would come and listen, a witness from outside, and then what I would go back and relate, and people would come and say, "How is life there?" and so on, and I feel myself like a raconteur. That it dawned on me that I was not really part of Palestine anymore. I was part of another kind of a Palestine, but not really part of the people, of my family, of what I wanted to be with, and that's another crime. I keep thinking
Absolutely.
of robbed of this experience.
Totally.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, briefly, I don't want to take up too much more of your time because you have a busy day.
Yeah.
Maybe tell, just briefly, how has life been since '93, since the return? I don't remember how many, there's something like 28,000 people that returned?
Something like this,
Yeah.
Yes.
And how has life been? How has it evolved? How has it shaped the cultural, political landscape? It's very complex.
Very, very complex, and I think one can say I'm a positive person, so I always look at it positively. But there are, because it meant physically Palestinians returned. They really did return. You can't run away from this. And this is what we want, And what happened on the ground after the return is something else. It's because the culprit is not that they returned. The culprit is that the occupation continued, and that the Oslo, was not implemented, and that there were violations right and all over the place. Israel did not commit to its commitment, or did not what you call it? Abide by their commitment. So things became very negative at moments. We had conflict up till now. We look at the conflicts we have within ourselves, and we have all sorts of people say, there's so much corruption, there's so much this. Well, of course there is. We can't run away from this, because now we're really in a cage, and we're a desperate people, and we are a people who are been defeated morally in the sense that we've been laughed upon. We really feel we're cheated. And you can't play with people, and you can't become healthy when you feel you become inside with a lot of desperation, a lot of anger, a lot of look at this. What really disturbs me is when people talk about the suicide bombings in the sense that it's just a religious kind of a shahada or something. Well, this is of course present in Islam, and you can't run away from it. And in a sense, one looks at it as resistance, as morally you are supporting your country and so on. But all the negativism that they put with the suicide bombing and the people who die as martyrs, the people who are defending their country, it's amazing. I mean, you're really defending your life, and you're ready to give your life for a cause. You can't laugh at this, and you can't belittle it. You can, of course, discuss it and so on, but you can't say, look at those Palestinians, look at those terrorists, look at those. What is this nonsense? This is really belittling any kind of respect for humanity or for human emotions and how they evolve. It's crazy, and I feel angry. Although I'm a pacifist at heart, and I don't believe in violence and all this thing, but I 100% feel that with some people, with situations, I feel privileged when I can come and go and travel sometimes and feel, have a change in my life. See my children sometimes who live abroad, who sometimes cannot come, I go and see them. But people who are deprived from the most important thing in their lives, when their homes are taken, their land is confiscated, they see a wall in their face, their army goes into their homes every night and searches and scares them and belittles them and it's suffocating really what's being done under occupation. And you want us to not reach this. It's abnormal not to reach a point of wanting to kill and get your right through armed resistance.
Yeah.
You have to do it. Some people you can't run away from it.
No, absolutely. I mean,
Of course, I don't belittle the politics and I don't belittle the organization but this is resistance. We're not doing it for the luxury of it. For heaven's sakes, really, it's so humiliating to have people just discuss it in a luxurious manner. Mm-hmm. This is violence. What is this?
No, it's resistance, absolutely. And it's the right of the occupied to resist and defend themselves and regain their land.
Leave us alone, give us back our country, and then you will see what we are. It will take us probably many years, but to heal and to reconcile. And when people now call for reconciliation, and call for friendship, and call for this, I don't think it is important. I think what's important is to get rid of occupation. This is the message that should come about, and I respect all our friends who wants us to really understand the Jewish. We don't need to understand the Jewish narrative, or for them to understand us. They need to know that they're occupying us. It's a political issue. Then the whole reconciliation will come naturally because it's been there in the first place, and because we're human beings in the first place. There will be remnants of course, hard experiences to deal with and reconcile with. There's blood been there, and we've been robbed on both sides of lives and dear ones. I don't belittle this at all, even on the Israeli side. But it is occupation. Now they should know it, and don't let. I think another. I think I call it belittling and almost disturbing thing is that the world wants us to reconcile and understand before the occupation ends. This is crazy.
Can't happen.
You can't have that. It is child talk. It's immature. They're laughing at us, and this is, I think, what is the most humiliating thing. So I'm sorry I get emotional about these things, but it's a living experience, and you do it. You live this every day. And because myself, I tend to be a pacifist, and I tend to feel that reconciliation is at the essence of relationships, mm-hmm. and respect of each other. I find it the more challenging is that people should not ask of us this before the right is being given us, before the wrong is being given.
No, you can't. There can't be a sense of normal life between two people when one completely dominates the life of the other.
And it's not a matter of having a conference with Jewish and Palestinian, or having a university in Israel, having brotherly relations or relations with the university in Palestine. There's no reality like this. We're occupied. We have somebody whose foot is on our necks and we can't breathe, and they want us to befriend that person. Let them lift their foot from our necks and breathe. Let us breathe, and then we can do it.
Absolutely.
Or we might not do it properly, or it will take us time, but it will be at least the healthy situation to do it.
Absolutely. Now, do you think, realistically, looking at the facts on the ground, it's almost 500,000 settlers in the West Bank. The Israeli idea of wanting to dominate the whole thing. Do you think realistically there can now be a real Palestinian state after all of this stuff, the way the West Bank is fragmented, it's so isolated from Gaza?
Of course, realistically, there could be something that you label Palestinian state. What it will be like, how it will be run, how do we move in it. Maybe probably to be more of the same. Maybe we'll have checkposts that are undeclared here and there. My with technology, we have checkposts in the skies. I mean, you have the satellites that check us.
Yeah, they're probably listening right now.
Yeah, so we have a settlement of Bethel just across. I see it from here every morning. And I see it move on the hills, like I keep talking about it like a water painting, the painting is running, from one area to the other on the facade. It's expanding, as so smoothly, so naturally, and so malignly, I would say, that you don't realize it until the whole hilltop is full of tops, of cottages and homes. And this is what they call natural growth.
Exactly.
And this is what, when it's foggy outside, I wrote this about the piece when I gave it to you. I'd go out on the balcony and see the whole fog just blocking the whole hill, the landscape in front of me. And I would say, I wish this is always the same, because it blocks the whole settlement from my face.
Yeah.
I don't think it will be something that is going to be really viable, but it will, like everything else, we will have to deal with it, even as a compromise for a short period, when I think politically things might change. And I'm very realistic, things might never change. But it's amazing that I look at ourselves, the children. Randa is here now, our daughter who lives in the States with her granddaughters. They live in this house. And I'm happy to tell them about the house. I'm happy to tell them about, our past, about Jaffa, about here. And somehow it's so natural that I think we will go on, even though it's not the way we want it. Even if a state in the political sense and in the correct sense is not there, but there is a Palestine that is there and will always be there as long as we're here. And the people are here. They will, it's not a heroic thing. It's not something that is just a slogan. People love it. People are here. We belong here. And we grow, and people live and die. People at moments become less. They talk about Christians leaving and Muslims staying, or Christians returning and Muslims leaving. Yani all this little things. But in history, this is nothing. This will go on, I think, as a presence.
Mm-hmm.
You will not talk of the details. You'll talk of a presence, and I think we'll always be here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you think there are a number of activists and scholars over the last 5 years that have been pushing for a serious consideration of the idea of a one-state solution, because they see that the possibility of a viable Palestinian state is long past, because Israel has created so many
If the Palestinian state is long past, a one state is even much more so. When now the push in Israel is for a Jewish state and for the world to declare the Jewishness of the Israeli state, where would the Palestinians or the Arabs or the Christians and Muslims be in Israel in such a framework? I find it's even much harder. And I think it's much more of a reality to have a two-state solution than a one-state. Ideally, of course, the Palestinians were the ones who called for a one-state solution. Democratic state.
Yeah.
They just didn't call it a democratic state, they called it. And that would have been the ideal.
Yeah.
And this, I think, reflects what Palestinians are and what we dream of. Things have changed along the way. But I think we still feel that. And maybe people who think of a one-state solution have this in mind in the background. But I don't think it's a practical thing. No.
Do you think if there was a way, with time, with a generation or even two, if that possibility could be made, because that would require a tremendous amount of international pressure to sort of reveal the racist facade of Israel.
Yes.
Do you think if that was the case, do you think you as a Palestinian can live in a state where Jews and Palestinians are the same?
Of course,
just like the way it was
I
in
won't think
Palestine?
twice about it. I really won't. Especially in my case, because I know of my own history about it and my family's relationship with the state, with the Jews, and I hate, religion was never really very highlighted in our family and in our society, the people around us. And so that's why I think I will feel very comfortable in this.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most natural thing under the sun.
I
So
agree.
yeah,
I'm-
I would say I'm not of those people who would say it's an impossibility. I think it would take less time than you would think even for reconciliation.
I agree.
Because
I think-
because the geography itself and the history, the shared history, and whatever you want to call it, the three religions or Jerusalem being at the center of all our, of our cultural history, social history, I think we'll all bring it together. It's almost man-made. There are things that are innate and there are things that are man-made. I don't know how you can put barriers, but I think Israel is and Palestine and the conflict is man-made. And when the least barriers that are removed, then the natural situation would come back by its own. There would be a healing process that's natural.
Yeah, I agree.
It's moving for me to talk about it because I don't think I will experience it, but I would hope that our
your
children's children, our children now are not experiencing it. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah. It is.
a very demanding, and I would say it's a very convoluted way of saying it's a blessing in a strange way to have the experience of experiencing something like this in your life. I feel I'm honored in a way because up till now I feel I'm whole as a person inside. I've been lucky in this, and to feel all what's going on and be conscious. Some of things I really feel are not conscious at all, or I will never be able to maybe bring them out. But the way I feel it's healthy. And I feel blessed about this, feeling like
very
this.
positive attitude to have that.
Yeah, it's crazy maybe for someone.
No, I don't think it's crazy. I think
And I don't say it out loud to many people, but I feel it.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel comfortable in my milieu, even, even under occupation, because I'm in Palestine. Yeah. And it's hard even for the children to understand.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a reflection of the wisdom and maturity that comes with living gracefully under stress for decades. That you've realized maybe there's something good that enriches.
It doesn't mean that I have my frustrating moments and desperate
and
moments. Especially that we can't live like this with our kids, that they can't come back easily. There's nothing physical about not coming back, but they've had their experience outside, and it's difficult for us to demand of them to come back, and although they feel they belong and they come back here, and some came back and worked here, then left and plan to come back again, but it's not a continuous thing because it's an unsettled situation.
Absolutely.
And it's not fair to ask of anyone.
No.
The choices, there is always a fork in the road that you have to take, and it's
a lot of people
the privilege of each one to do it.
Everybody's got to make their own decision.
Look at you, this is wonderful what you're doing. If you are living your experience away, have also enriched your giving to Palestine in a wonderful way that would also keep it for generations.
Absolutely.
So we all have our little things to do.
And we all work out.
We all I think fit in a wonderful healthy way. So thank God. I think this is the blessing of Palestine. If they say it's a holy place.
The holiness of work.
The holiness of work.
Is there anything that you'd like to end by saying? I mean, I don't have any other questions. Is there anything that you'd like to say either to...
Well, just one little thing about my experiences with I think because I feel very close to the crafts of Palestine. And I think this is part of an identity that I've been very much involved in, and without even my also being conscious of. I grew up in in Bire, and where a lot of the village women, like in all over Palestine, would embroider their own costumes and have wonderful patterns and colors and so on. And I had a neighbor who we had a neighbor in El Bire where we lived who had a lovely collection of costumes, and she would ask me to help her, air them in the sun every spring and then put them back again so I could feel the texture and I saw the colors. And she would teach me, she taught me how to embroider. She would sit under a tree. Literally, it was this physical kind of a setup, which was wonderful. So, and my parents were very artistic, and they were conscious always of design and beautiful colors and harmonious things at home, in our house, paintings and embroidered pieces and so on. Anyway, I grew up to be really involved in the crafts of Palestine, especially with my work as a volunteer with Inash al-Usra, the Women's Society in El Bire. And in one way, it was like caretaking of the embroidery and the crafts. At the same time, it was like supporting women who could embroider. We would sell their work, and so help support them as in their families, especially during when their husbands or family members or something, the breadwinners, would be in prison or could not find work under occupation. They were able to do the embroidery at home, and we would sell the embroidery. Slowly, I became more involved in doing more design work and interested in documentation of the embroidery motifs, because like everything else, it's a folk thing. And when the occupation took place, when in 48 especially, the women, to earn more money, started selling their costumes to collectors and to museums and so on to earn money. So the tradition of having a costume in the family to give to your daughter and for her to learn the embroidery, this was all unsettled, broken. So the old motifs were being forgotten. And when we lived in Amman, I became good friends with Widad Qawar, who is a major collector in the world, an international collector of Palestinian costumes. She started her collection also after 48, when she realized that the costumes were being sold and lost. And of course, material gets disintegrates. With that, and I thought seriously about, this was a thought I had in Inash al-Usra when I worked with them, that the women were using patterns from European magazines, which was fine and normal because they would buy, and women always have this innovative, wanting to be à la mode, wanting to be, even the embroidery from France became on the Palestinian national dress, it was an interesting thing. Anyway, so we worked on documenting the Palestinian embroidery on her collection. We studied about 100 years of embroidery from 1850, that was the oldest dress that she had, to 1950 when the Israel was created and the Palestinian Nakba, took place. And we had a book published. And that, to us, it was really a major thing. Now the book is in its 3rd edition, and we have a special edition in Palestine, for Palestine, going to be printed this year in the commemorating the Jerusalem being the capital of culture in 2009. Then later on, I became involved in also publishing a book or writing getting together embroidered flowers from Palestine. Wildflowers of Palestine. That was also very much part of my growing up in the landscape around, in the hills of Ramallah and Bire, and it was an aunt of mine who designed them, but I collected the pieces in a book called The Spring Is Here. It's bilingual, and I'm continuing my work in embroidery. I don't embroider myself, but I also get, write articles about it here and there, and
that's nice.
That's
part of keeping the tradition.
Yes.
Not just keeping it alive, but actually resurrecting it after it's been shattered.
Yes, especially that we became conscious that the Israelis we're taking this embroidery, Palestinian ethnic embroidery, I would say, and calling it
Call
as
their own.
their own. They had at one time even the El Al hostesses wearing costumes embroidered in beautiful embroidery. There, I mean, I'm not saying anything about the quality or the colors of the, but it was the fact that they were calling it Israeli embroidery was something that was like everything else, a sham and a lie.
They stole everything.
And
so this,
my work in embroidery is, I think, satisfies my artistic inclinations and also some kind of a Palestinian, keeping the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian tradition also. Because it's still going on, beautiful embroidery is still being done and sold.